Good evening. I'd like to share something with you today. It's a message that God gave me a few months ago. And during this message, I'll also be giving some of my personal testimony. And I hope you will enjoy it. There's three things, though, that I would like you to think about during this message. Number one is, are you blessed? Number two, are you a good steward? Number three, are you a blessing to others? I was watching Brother Robert Morris on TV some time ago, and he was talking about one of his books called Beyond Blessed. He was speaking about giving, and he explains giving in a much different way than most other TV and radio ministries. He believes that you get to give and not give to get, as most others teach. And he also teaches that your tithes belong in the local church. As I was watching him, God impressed me to order that book. And when I received the book, I began reading. And as I was reading the book, God says, I'm going to show you why I have blessed you through the years. And in this message, I'm going to try to show you that you should give from what God has given you. And if you do, He will bless you. God blesses us because He loves us. He not only wants us to be blessed, but He also wants us to be a blessing to others. It all started with Abraham. In Genesis 12:2, God told Abraham, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. He told Abraham that he would be a blessing to others. One of the greatest things I have come to understand is that God owns everything that I have. Psalms 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. The world and all its people belong to Him. Psalms 50:10-12, for all the animals of the forest are mine, and I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird on the mountains, and I know the animals of the field are mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for all the world is mine, and everything in it. So not only the cattle and the birds are His, but the hills are His also. Let me ask a question here. Do you believe the money you have is yours? Think about it. According to what I just read, God owns everything. There are three things that we all need to remember. Number one, we have to understand that it all belongs to God. And number two, when God tells us to give something, don't grieve over it because it's not really ours. And number three, the first belongs to God. It is not just 10%, it is the first 10%. Let me give you an example of number two. When I was in the Fairfield Church a few years ago, one Sunday, there was a young man came in, and for some reason, my eyes just fixed on him. And I kept watching him, and he went over and had a seat. And another gentleman for the church walked over to him and handed him an envelope. And as I said, for some reason, my eyes were just fixed on that young man. So I saw him open that envelope, and it had money in it. Well, I never thought too much about that. But my eyes kept going back to that young man, So during the service, my eyes would just continue to go to him more than anything else. And then God spoke to me and He said, I want you to take every penny of money that you have in your pocket and give it to that young man. And I carry my money in a money clip. So I reached in my front pocket and I got out the money that I had. And I pulled it out of the clip and I began to count it. And God said, I didn't tell you to count that money. I told you to take it and give it to that young man. Well, later on in the service, the pastor called for everybody to come to the altar to pray. And I did. And when we went there, I just walked up to that young man and gave him the money and told him, I said, I'm supposed to give you this. And I walked away. So what I'm trying to say is, when God tells you to give something, you just do what he says. You obey what he tells you to do. And that's what I have tried to do. And only that day, I thought I should count the money to see how much I was giving away. But it wasn't mine, so it didn't matter. Exodus 13:2. Dedicate to me every firstborn among the Israelites. The first offspring to be born of both humans and animals belongs to me. Exodus 23:19. The best of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. The first fruits for you and I are our paychecks. In other words, the tithes. Listen very closely to what he says. He says, bring them into the house of the Lord your God. He doesn't say to give them, he says bring them. Again, this proves that they belong to God. Let me give you my testimony about tithing. When I first got into the church, and really I got into the church because of a miracle. My youngest daughter was born in 1963, and she was very ill when she was born. And she was sick for a total of 9 months or so. And she had projectile vomiting. If you don't know what that is, when she would vomit, it would just squirt out of her mouth, sometimes 3, 4, and 5 feet. And it was not a pretty sight. But she was very ill. And my wife's uncle was a Church of God preacher. He's passed away now. But he was a Church of God preacher, and he had come into Cincinnati and was pastoring a little church over in Covington, Kentucky. Well, he came to visit us one day, and he said, could I pray for the baby before I leave? And of course, we did not object. He picked the child up, and he prayed for her, laid her down in her crib, and she went to sleep. That night, she slept all night long for the first time in her life. Prior to that, the way that child would sleep would be if I laid on my back and I held her in my arms like this with her stomach down on me, and I held her that way, and she would sleep. Otherwise, she would cry and scream out as if she was in pain. But we endured that for the 9 months, and after my wife's uncle prayed for her, she never had another problem. Well, we began to go to church with them, and in December of that year, a young man by the name of Leon Petrie, an evangelist, came to the church to have a revival, and I rededicated myself to the Lord that night. Shortly after that, God began to deal with me about paying tithes. And I'll tell you, I was not very good at it. I would pay for a while, and I'd skip a week, and so on and so forth, because I thought I needed that money for my family. And that went on for several months, I suppose. But it went on for a long time. And then one day, God began to show me something. And that was that every time that I would fail to pay my tithes, something would happen to where I had to spend that money. Sometimes a little more, but most of the time, it was almost to the penny what my tithes would have been if I had paid them. So I made God a promise. I said, Lord, I will, beginning with my next paycheck, my first check will be written to you. Not knowing about what I'm talking about right now. But I promised God that I would write my first check for the tithes when I got my paycheck. And I started doing that. And when I started doing that, God began to bless me. I had more money. I was not making more money, but I had more money to spend, not only for me, but for my family. God works in very mysterious ways sometimes, but he blesses those who do the things that he tells them to do. When I began to pay tithes, not only did he bless me before that, but he started blessing me in my work. Within a year of the time I began to pay my tithes with the first check, I had the job that I would retire from. I worked that job up until 1994. And when I started that job, I had nothing. I had no automobile. I had nothing. No home. We were living in furnished rooms at the time. But when I got that job and started, and in 1994, I retired. I was 55 years old. I was 25 years old when I started with the Lord. At the age of 55, I retired. I had a home. I had 2 brand new cars that were paid off. My home was paid off. I owed no one anything. In that length of time, God blessed me so much that I was able to do all of those things. And then I was able to go to work with the church and spend most of my time working with the church. And I did that. I was in about 5 churches. And every church that I went to in those years, eventually I wound up being the tithe treasurer. And then God blessed the church as well. But God blesses you if you do what he asks of you to do. And he blessed me, and blessed me tremendously, because I gave him his portion that he asked us to give. And there's 2 things that I discovered a long time ago. And that is that you can't outgive God. And that blessing others as the Holy Spirit prompts you is just about as much fun as you'll ever have. The story of Cain and Abel is a story that I never really understood. And I never really heard it adequately explained until Brother Morris explained about the first fruits. Listen to this story. It's Genesis 4, verses 3 through 5. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. But for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. Notice, Abel brought the firstborn, and Cain only brought an offering of the fruit of the ground, not the first fruits. Your tithe, which is the first 10%, belongs to God. The other 90% also belongs to God. And you are the steward or caretaker of what is left. The 90% is for your needs and to bless others. You will be surprised how much you will have if you put God first. God can do more with that 90% than you can with 100%. We hear a lot of teaching about tithing. Some even say it's not in the New Testament and that it even was under the law, and we're not under the law. And that is true. But notice the time in the story of Cain and Abel that happened about 4000 BC, just to clarify that a little. Abraham was about 2000 BC. The law came through Moses, 1500 BC. Cain and Abel was 2,500 years before the law, when God accepted the firstborn offering, but did not accept another. because it was not the first fruits. Did you know Abraham was the first to pay tithes? And it was about 500 years before the law. In Genesis 14, 18 through 20, and Melchizedek, the king of Salem, and a priest of God Most High, brought Abram some bread and wine. Melchizedek blessed Abram with this blessing. Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has defeated your enemies for you. Then Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of all the goods he had recovered. We give tithes like Abraham gave them, not by the law, but by faith. If God's people gave 10% before the law and 10% under the law, shouldn't we who are under grace do the same? There is a passage in Hebrews which deals with this issue directly. It is Hebrews 7 and 8. And I want to read this in the Message because I think it explains it better. The Message translation. Hebrews 7 and 8. He says, or look at it this way. We pay our tithes to priests who die, but Abraham paid tithes to a priest who the scripture says lives. Some people think this is a new issue. It is as old as the 2nd century when more and more Gentiles were being converted. The early Jewish believers had no problem with tithing since they had done it under the law and gave it to the priest. They simply gave their tithes to the elders of the church and did by love. However, as the church became less Jewish, this issue came up to the church fathers. They answered the question of tithing with Matthew 23 and 23 and Luke 11:42. Matthew 23:23, I'll read first. What sorrow awaits you teachers of religious law and you Pharisees, hypocrites, for you're careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb gardens, but you ignore the other aspects of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. You should tithe, yes, but do not neglect the other things. Luke 11:42. What sorrow awaits you, Pharisees, for you are careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb gardens, but you ignore justice and the love of God. You should tithe, yes, but do not neglect the other things. That's in the New Testament, friends. Notice Jesus said you should tithe, yes. The bottom line is the tithes belong to God. God calls the person who does not return the tithe a thief. In Malachi 3, he says, you robbed me. Malachi 3, 8 through 9, and this is in the Message also. Begin by being honest. Do honest people rob God? But you rob me day after day. You ask, how have we robbed you? The tithe and the offering, that's how. And now you're under a curse, the whole lot of you, because you're robbing me. And in Leviticus 27:30, 1/10 of the produce of the land, whether grain from the fields or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord and must be set apart to him as holy. Anytime you get an opportunity to give, you have an opportunity to be blessed. People think God wants them to tithe so the church can be taken care of. That's not true. God wants us to tithe so we can be taken care of. God does not need our money. When we put God first, not only does our finances come in order, but our family as well. Let's go to the parable of the talents. I'm going to show you that he's talking about money. If you would like to follow along, I will be reading in Matthew 25, 14 through 29. For it will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown, and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. A talent is a sum of money. It is 10,000 denarii. A denarius was a day's wage. Denarius is singular, and denarii is plural. 300 denarii was a year's wage. 10,000 denarii was considered a lifetime wage. The person who received 1 talent got a lifetime of wages. God judges us by what he gives each of us. You notice he wanted them to expand his resources. He told the 1 talent man, you should have put it in the bank where it would have been protected and drawn interest. Luke 16:12. And if you're not faithful with other people's sayings, why should you be trusted with things of your own? Matthew 25:23. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Matthew 25:29. To those who use well what they are given, even more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who do nothing, even what little they have will be taken away. Giving is only one part of being blessed. If we're generous, but not a good steward, God will never open the windows of heaven to us. The reason being, we will not manage it well. If you are a good steward, but you're stingy with what he has given you, why would he bless you with more? His purpose is to get the help to the people in need. God will bless us if we don't distribute it. God will bless us, but if we don't distribute it as we should, he will move on to someone else. He will find someone who will pass it on because he is trying to help those who need help. Genesis 12:2. I will bless you so you can be a blessing. 2 things. You must be generous. You must be a good steward. Let me tell you about the first time God asked me to bless someone. It wasn't very long after I got myself together and started giving God the first 10% of my income. I was in that little old church in Covington, Kentucky. And one Sunday night, I'm sitting there, and there's a gentleman in the church who had a family, married and had a family, and had just had a newborn child. God impressed upon me to give him a sum of money. And I fought with that myself all during the service. But as the service ended, I took that sum of money and I went up to the gentleman and I shook his hand, as is the custom, and I just palmed that money in his hand. He never said a word to me. He just took the money and he left. So I began to wonder after that, did I embarrass him? What happened? Because I really didn't know. But the following week, on the following Sunday night, he came to me and he said, Brother, he said, you had no idea what my needs were when you gave me that money, did you? I said, no, God just impressed me to give it to you. He said, well, I had got laid off from my job. I had not received any unemployment. And you know, we have the new baby. And he said we had no milk in the house for the baby. And there's other items that we were in need of and we didn't have. He said, but we stopped on the way home with the money that you gave us. And we got every item that we needed. And we had a few dollars left over. Even when we don't know what we're doing, God knows. And when God, from that day on, when God impressed me to do something, I never argued. I tried my best to comply with whatever he told me to do. And I have always been blessed because of that. There are two things. You must be generous and you must be a good steward. A lot of people get upset when the pastor begins to talk about money. Did you know the Bible talks a lot about money? Every time someone worshiped, they brought an offering to God. God commanded it. He is the one who set up tithing. Remember, God owns everything. The money that we call ours, think about it. How did we get it? You might say, I earned it. But really, God blessed you with it. He gave you the job. He gave you the health and strength to do the job. So what you have still belongs to God. You are the steward of what God has given you to manage. Matthew 6:21. For when your treasure is there, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Many people get that backwards and say, where your heart is, there your treasure will be. That's not what it says. Giving is a blessing. God blesses us for two reasons. Number one, because he loves us. And number two, he blesses us so we can bless others. You must be able to manage your finances so you can bless other people. Let me tell you about an instance where God asked me to help someone and told me exactly how he wanted me to do it. I was in the Town Street Church, and we were at a thing set up in the church where that we helped people, and especially the members of the church. Well, we had a young lady in the church who came to us and said that her husband was laid off and that they were in need of food and so on. So I was told to make sure that they got the food and everything that they needed. And the church at that time was only helping people with food because we had had problems before that with helping with other items. So I bought all the food that they needed for their home. But during the course of talking to the young lady, I found out that they owed a gas and electric bill. And if they didn't have it paid by a certain time, then it was going to be turned off and they would be without gas and electric in the home. So God told me, he says, I want you to pay that bill. But he said, this is the way I want you to do it. He said, I want you to take the money and put it in an envelope and take it to their home and put it in the mailbox. And since I was a city letter carrier, nobody would be the wiser when I walked up in uniform and put this money in the envelope in the mailbox. And that's exactly what I did. Well, the following week, this young lady came to church and her husband was with her for the first time. And during the course of that service, he came forward and gave his life to the Lord. Afterward, his wife got up and she gave a testimony. And she told the story that he went to the mailbox, that they owed the gas and electric bill, and that he was the one who went to the mailbox and got the envelope and opened up the envelope. And there was exactly enough money in that envelope to pay for their gas and electric bill. She said, but that's not all. He was worried all this time about that bill. But she said, I kept telling him, you don't worry about that bill. God is going to pay for it. And God did. If you don't understand that God is the owner of everything, you will not be a good steward. Is the money we have ours? No, I don't think so. It belongs to God. Psalms 24, verse 1. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. God said we could test him. Malachi 3:10. Bring the full tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and thereby put me to the test, says the Lord of hosts. If I will not open up the windows of heaven for you and pour down for you a blessing until there is no more need. Just like God promised when I put him first and allowed him to take charge of my finances, everything fell in place, and I can tell you it worked in my life. Now, those things that I wanted you to think about. Are you blessed? Are you a good steward? Are you a blessing to others? I think I have given you enough information to answer all of these questions. There's just one little story before I close. A few weeks ago, I got a phone call from my bank, and they wanted me to come in and talk about the money that I had in the bank and the way that it was distributed and so on and so forth. So I made an appointment, and I went in, and I was greeted by a young man, and he began to tell me that I needed to do this and that and so on. I said, well, you got to understand something. I said, God is my broker. My money I put my money where God tells me to put it. We went on talking, and I said, well, can I tell you a story? And he said, sure. So I told him the story about my tithes that I have related to you and how God blessed me. So I said, I don't put my money anywhere unless God tells me to put it there. So when we finished up, he said, well, if I were you, I would make one little change here at least. And he showed me something then, and I felt that was agreeable, and I made that one little change. And after we finished, he shook my hand, and he said, I want to thank you for telling me the story. And I said, well, that's just the way it is. I don't do anything with my money unless God tells me. He said, well, you don't understand. He said, I'm a new Christian. He said, I just past week paid tithes for the first time. Now, I don't know why why God did that. I don't know. But God knows what he's doing. Did it help that young man? I don't know. Only God knows. But let me tell you something else about all of the dates and times and everything that's in this message that I've given you today. That came from the book Beyond Blessed by the gentleman that wrote that book, Brother Robert Morse. And there's a lot more in that book that would help you other than just what I've told you in this little message that I really and truly believe that God gave me. And I know you can tell by listening that I'm not a preacher. But this is a message that God gave me, and I just wanted to share it with you. And I hope God blesses you if you will listen and do what he tells you to do. I know that he will. Thank you.